Hello, everybody. My name is Plastow. I'm a lecturer in classical studies here at the Open University. So I'm not a social scientist, I'm a humanist, a classicist. But I think that, well, as I'll explain in a minute, I think it's really important that we have these conversations across disciplines and across kind of disciplinary, larger disciplinary areas like the arts and humanities and social sciences, even the hard sciences and STEM subjects. So yes, so I'm a lecturer in classical studies, and I'm also the co-artistic director of a theatre company based in London called By Jove Theatre Company. I was actually a theatre maker before I was an academic, so I've kind of brought that with me, and it took me a while to actually draw those two things together and start sort of explicitly drawing connections between my academic work and my work in theatre. But recently I have started doing that more, and I've done a few projects that have explored essentially the use of classical mythology, Greek and Roman myths, to speak to modern day concerns, so particularly to speak to feminist and queer issues. We've done a series of plays which we called A Season of Violent Women, which explores the character of Medea, from Medea, the character of Agave from the Bacchae, and we brought a little bit of Shakespeare in there. So we had Margaret of Anjou from the Henry plays and Richard III to explore these images of women that we see in kind of canonical stories and myths as that their violence is particularly shocking for some reason due to their supposed femininity or whatever it is. So we explored that. We also have recently done a work which was a digital installation, partially because of lockdown. We couldn't end up doing a physical play, but in fact we found the digital mode was interesting to explore. The piece was called The Gentlest Work, and it explored the myths of Orestes. You may know the Oresteia, the famous story of Clytemnestra kills her husband Agamemnon when he comes home from war with another woman, and for a whole lot of other reasons, like the fact that he sacrificed her daughter 10 years ago. And then Orestes, their son, comes back after 20 years and kills Clytemnestra, the mother. So it's this kind of cycle of vengeance in the family. We explored that story through a queer lens, exploring elements of same-sex desire between Orestes and the character who's usually called his companion, Pylades, a young man who he grows up with, and also other characters, and exploring ideas of family and queer family and found family and these kinds of elements. Those were mostly projects that kind of, the research element of them was exploring how we can use modern interpretations of the texts to think about the ancient texts in new ways. A new project that we're developing now, which is actually registered on the Open Societal Challenges platform, is about mythic storytelling in the changing environment and how we might use ancient stories about humans and their relationship with the natural world to understand our relationship with the natural world now as the environment changes more drastically. So that's the kind of work I've been doing. The other thing that might be interesting or relevant to this group is that I am the leader of a new research group, newish research group based in the School of Arts and Humanities called Creative Interactions, where we're exploring these kinds of projects that sit at the intersection of creative practice and academic research. We've been going for just about a year now, but it has been very small scale, and I'm trying to expand it out a little bit more outside of the School of Arts and Humanities and bringing in people from other disciplines. So what we've been doing there is kind of bringing people together for discussions, workshops, showcases of projects and so on, to explore how creative practice and academic research can work together and support each other with kind of, let's say, mutually beneficial outcomes for both sides. And I think that's something I'll probably come back to talk about a little bit more later. I'll stop talking there because I think that's quite enough for now.
Great, thank you. I will turn online then, and maybe Siobhan, would you like to introduce yourself and your work a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I might actually share a slide also, if that's okay. That works for you, does it? Okay. So, hello everyone, I'm Siobhan Campbell. I'm from the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing, and creative writing is the side I mainly work on. And I have been working in what I'm calling social literary practice. I'm writing the book on that at the moment. So I have to call it that for the best part of 2 decades, I guess. But in the manner of creative writing, where you learn by doing, I think it also applies in arts-based research. You are only learning what the processes are as you're actually doing them, which can feel fairly scary initially. However, having done it for a while now, I feel I can say I'm also an arts-based researcher. So my first slide just makes some connections, which are fairly self-evident, and you'll know them, between creative writing approaches and pedagogies and arts-based research approaches and pedagogies, if you like, or methodologies, really. But to introduce my sort of range of work, I'll just give you a sense of the kind of partners we've been working with over years. I began working with military veterans with Combat Stress UK, and then moved on to work with the Veterans Outreach Support Group. So that's using creative writing as an alternative and parallel to other psychosocial supports, both in clinical and non-clinical settings. So creative writing used by, for instance, the anger management group in Combat Stress UK, monitored by a psychologist, and something we might talk about is the kinds of ethical monitoring you might need when you're doing some of this work. I've worked in a number of human rights advocacy situations and post-conflict situations with the NGO mentioned there, ACAR Network for Development in Lebanon, and with PPR, that's Practice of Rights in Northern Ireland. Participation and Practice of Rights in Northern Ireland. It's a great title, actually, because it goes straight to ABR principles, I guess. Other than that, then I've done some work in Iraq, Jordan, and currently I'm working with 2 NHS trusts in a project that began, and I'll give you a little bit of detail on this. It began with working with frontline healthcare workers during COVID. And because they wanted to continue, it went on after COVID. So we have 2 different sets of data and approaches, if you like. And we had to be pretty agile, which is something ABR practitioners have to be. So we had to move online, use our prompts in different ways, develop different kinds of writing exercises that would work online, and learn ourselves how to operate online with writing groups. No mean feat in the end. However, what this slide shows is that in terms of the monitoring of results in their parlance, they were looking for psychosocial supports that could enable the participants to feel they were able to cope more, to have a place to express their feelings, to share those and actually support each other through the sharing, and also to we used the WEMWEB, that's the psychosocial scales. I can talk more about them later. Warwick Edinburgh is the full title. To monitor whether levels of depression and anxiety were actually being mitigated somewhat. I myself have some reservations about linking ABR to that kind of metrics, but we can talk about that later as well, perhaps. Just to give you a flavor of sort of things emanating from those workshops, reading The Wild Geese by Mary Oliver elicited several very literary responses, and this is something I'm thinking about at the moment, which is how ABR allows us to see certain strengths in people where you might not fully expect those strengths to be. And I found that with the military veterans as well. They were immediately able to think in symbolic terms, make metaphors, and readily understand thematic links and through lines in literature. Things we might think as teachers we have to teach, but actually life teaches, I guess, especially if people are working under certain pressures. And just finally then, I'll finish with a little quote which characterizes some of the writing that the workshop participants in the NHS did during COVID and just after, when they were really very much in crisis. I only cry at night. That's when I allowed myself to cry, so I can function in the day. And you could imagine how sharing that kind of writing allowed others in the workshop group to then open up and share their experiences, and that the writing of those experiences into story or a little small memoir piece or poems often seem to allow a certain detachment, and psychologists corroborate this, that if you make something of an experience, you're in a sense assigning a set of meanings to it, and that you can then sometimes detach from it and see it from a distance and thereby move on. But that's enough about me for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. Charlotte, would you like to comment?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Charlotte Vincent. Sorry I can't be there in person today, last minute change there from my end. I'm the Artistic Director and Chief Executive of Vincent Dance Theatre, and that's a company that I have led for nearly 30 years now. And we are a national portfolio organisation funded by the Arts Council of England, and obviously earning income through distributing and producing work and mentoring and teaching and all the usual stuff that a dance theatre company does. I think the reason I'm here is that I've also just passed a PhD reflecting on my own practice. So I'm now Dr. Vincent, so that's quite exciting for me. So I thought I would just, I probably sort of am a metaphor for what we're talking about, because I've got 30 years of on the ground practice, choreographing and directing work. And obviously in the last 2 years, I did a PhD by publication. So half of it was my work and half of it was a thesis. And I did it at under the supervision of Professor Angela Pickard at Canterbury Christchurch University, who interestingly has just moved from the dance education department into running the Sydney DeHaan Centre for Arts and Wellbeing. So we're going to be working together going forward, because my work is very engaged with the wellbeing side of things as well. So just really briefly, I founded the company Vincent Dance Theatre in 1994 in Sheffield, and following, interestingly, Siobhan, an English literature degree. So text is a really interesting thing that weaves its way through my interdisciplinary work. And we basically make work that foregrounds the complex tensions between non-professional, which some people call community engagement, and professional practice. And that's a development of the work over the last 10 years. So for the first 20 years of the life of the company, I was more of an archetypal choreographer, making work on the middle, went up to the middle scale, and were doing stuff in Queen Elizabeth Hall and traveling the world. And then I became a mum, and so didn't want to travel very much, and started working differently, because I wanted my dance theatre work to have some use in the world beyond performing to ourselves, which I think the dance field is quite good at, performing to ourselves and not finding ways to take the work that we make into non-arts situations. So that's what I've been focusing on. The use and the application of my work over the last 10 years. And so I guess we set out to explore contemporary themes and socio-political issues. We set out to provoke thought and stimulate debate. And we're guided by my politics, really, which are a feminist approach that involves researching, developing and devising new work, usually these days in collaboration with young people, and women to offer a public platform to those whose voices may not otherwise be heard. And so a focus for me is working with care experience, always having a third kids involved that are care experienced, and usually working with women who are usually categorised as vulnerable, for example, in domestically violent relationships or misusing substances. So I'm actively targeting groups to work with that will address some of the issues around misogyny and the patriarchy and violence towards women, and how that impacts on young people throughout the work. And that's been a thread since 1994, really, when I first started out. So we encourage care experienced young people and their families to engage with the work. We provide a ladder of opportunities for adopted and kids in care throughout the company's projects. We make work and we distribute it locally, nationally and globally in physical spaces and online. And what I mean by that is the work is collaborative, it's socially engaged, it's feminist dance theatre, but I usually, in a nutshell, make a live piece of work, capture it as a live capture, and then I make a version of that work on film. So that will become either a full-length film installation or excerpts and shorts that can be used in various different contexts. So I sort of reversion the live beyond just a capture of a stage show from the same creative choreographic inquiry, and those assets are then on film are then able to be distributed and applied in arts and non-arts context. So a film installation might be shown in a gallery or in a foyer of a theatre, or indeed in an adapted theatre space, and then maybe an excerpt of, say, part of that might be used, like we used it in University of Brighton a couple of weeks ago, as a stimulation for training social workers to really address the emotional labour of what they're doing, not just the practical side of learning to be a social worker. So the work is really beginning to be used in a real range of non-arts venues, and that's where I'm heading with my own research. We're known as a trauma-informed or trauma-aware socially engaged company. It's imbued with critical thinking and always has been, because that's just the way that my mind works. And obviously, to make the work, I collaborate with a range of long-term collaborators who are dance performers and artists in their own right, writers, composers and lighting designers and producers, and what I'm sort of framing as non-professionals, so those targeted groups that I mentioned. So really, in summary, the work that Vincent Dance Theatre make is socially engaged, it's practice-led, so we're always learning from the practice and developing policies and protocols, for example, around safeguarding around that. It's mindful, because we place safeguarding, trauma awareness and trust, actually the building of trust over long-term projects with the people that we work with. And we're very proactive in promoting equality of opportunity in the widest sense of the word. And I would say that the work I create is quite complex and contemporary. So just second little bit is that the PhD that I've just written is, the title is Reflecting on the Collaborative Practice and Socially Engaged Principles Underpinning the Making of Vincent Dance Theatre's Art of Attachment. And Art of Attachment is a piece that I made in collaboration, a little bit like what you've been talking about, Siobhan, with a drug and alcohol misuse charity organisation in Brighton called Oasis Project. And I worked over a very long time with the phase 2 recovery women in phase 2 recovery programme to create a live production and then the consequent film installation of that piece with COVID in between. So that and the PhD is basically reflecting on how I made the work, why I made the work, my experience of making the work, the women's experience of making work, the reaction to the work, and it's essentially a case study of a very specific research and creation process that then identifies the general politics and methodology of how I work with as a choreographer director. And I suppose in summary, and as with everything that everybody said, we can come back to some of these things. It's a commentary that reflects and analyses the methods of my creative processes as an artist. It's a case study of 2 specific pieces of work on stage and on film, which obviously demonstrates the methodology online and in person, you know, live and on film. It's driven by a creative inquiry into attachment theory, John Bowlby's attachment theory, and Ainsworth's attachment theory. So there is an underpinning of those theories, and there's a context of how other companies in the UK and beyond work sort of in this way, but perhaps not quite in the way that I work. So I've tried to pull out what's different about my practice. It's a study of inclusivity and democratization and not othering other people, which I think is an important point to come back to. So we talk about artists and non-artists, or some choreographers talk about that. And I think we're all artists, and we just need to provide methodologies through which we can find creative agency in people that are not trained, let's say. And I think we're quite good at that. And it also highlights the gender politics at play, this art of attachment in the wider society, as I've mentioned before, the gender-based violence that leads women to substance misuse in the first place, and often leads children to be removed into care from those situations. So it's all sort of tied in. Yeah, it's a study of collaboration and agency, and I can talk more about how that works maybe later in the discussion, but that's a sort of potted history of where I'm at. Now I've got a horrible echo going on.
Is it me?
I think
I'm so sorry. I thought I should not.
Horrible. Sorry, that sounded like a fire alarm. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
We're good. Just a reminder to those that are online, if you can keep your mics in mute when you're not speaking, because that's what causes the feedback sometimes.
I'm so sorry.
And so we'll move.
I wanted to monitor the chats.
Oh, that's right. Don't worry. Oh, I haven't been monitoring the
No,
chat.
that's
good.
because I said I would do that. Sorry.
But I will turn directly to, well, we're learning how these things work, so it's all good. I'll turn to George now to just introduce himself and his projects. And then we'll get into more of a conversation, picking up some of the things that you've highlighted.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Sorry, I'm not with you in person today. I'll try and be brief because I've talked about this stuff on several occasions within not too distant past. What can I say? Well, I'm a cultural geographer, and for most of my working life, I've been a kind of critical cultural historian, using works of art, music, etc., to think about environmental understandings, approaches, values, etc., in a kind of critical way through different periods in history, particularly through the 18th and 19th centuries. So in that sense, my work was inspired, like so many people who come from critical cultural history in this respect, by, the classics of Raymond Williams, John Barrell, or in musicology, Susan McClary and Richard Lepert and people like that. And then that was all very fine, but of course it didn't interest my undergraduates one little bit, because it was all very esoteric. So I ended up teaching environmental materials, and for many years I taught environment and environmental understandings, values, politics, etc., on a kind of really radical and unusual program at a place called Oxford Brookes, who pioneered a way of teaching through practical experience, through experimentation, through imagination. So the kind of thing that we would do is we'd tell our students, here's a brief. And it might be a theory of the picturesque, or it might be contingent valuation, or it might be Jainism, or a whole number of theories or ideas or philosophies related to the environment. And they would have to walk a section of the River Cherwell and value it according to the theory that they were working with, and then come back and perform it to the students as some kind of dramatic enactment. And we thought that by doing that, it enabled students to get a handle on some fairly esoteric stuff and to make it their own through living it and living it out, practicing it. And for years, there was a mismatch between me sitting in with my books and reading this erudite theory and doing this kind of very practical and hugely entertaining teaching in which we didn't lecture, we just facilitated. We provided materials, we had workshops, we had discussions and seminars, and then the students took over, they did the teaching. And I worked at the OU for a few years and there was no space for this kind of teaching whatsoever. And a colleague of mine, Joe Smith, who's now head of the RGS, said, I got a really great idea for a project. What we'll do is we will take BBC Environmental Archives and we'll work with young people and let them mash them up and remake those environmental stories so that they can tell their own stories about environment and their worries and fears and expectations about the environment using BBC Environmental Archives. And I thought, yeah, do you know what? That's what we used to do at Oxford Brookes with our students. Maybe you can use this kind of experimental creative method as a way of researching as well as a way of teaching. And then I read a little book by Pablo Helguera, who I think works at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or at least he did for a while. And he said, well, in this kind of context, artists have to be more like teachers and social scientists, and teachers have to be more like social scientists and artists, etc., etc. And I thought, well, yes, that's exactly. And we were teachers, and we were a bit like artists, and we were also a bit like social scientists. So maybe we as social science researchers need to perform this kind of hybrid space in between these different inverted commas professional spaces. And we embarked on a series of research projects, and we've worked a lot in North Norfolk using sound and forms of sonic engagement and making music and soundscapes with groups and publics to get them to think about environmental change, change on the coast related to sea level rise and climate change, etc. And we've been doing that since about 2016-17. And we've just finished our final installation at Wells Maltings, which is a series of sonic postcards, which are short sound works, 10-15 minutes at the maximum, and they kind of set out an environmental issue, and they're made in collaboration with groups and publics. Some of them we give them over entirely to the public themselves to make. Some we've worked in collaboration with, etc. So a variety of different forms of working depending on the subject matter and the group concerned. And the idea of these works is that they raise a particular environmental issue, problem, challenge, whatever it is, and set the listener thinking about that so that they can make up their own mind and reach a decision or think about it in a more informed way. And partly the inspiration for that is, of course, the fact that we seem to be living in a world where everything's so polarized and everybody seems so set in their ways and everybody seems to live in a media bunker in which they never hear something from somebody they disagree with. And we're trying to problematize and challenge that because we believe that the complex environmental issues, challenges of the Anthropocene, require us to handle them in a complex way, which means understanding a wide range of points of view. It means listening to the kind of voices that never get heard. So some of those are human voices, and some of those are environmental voices too. Flora, fauna, soil microbes, whatever. And give all these different constituents a voice in speaking around the challenge in whatever way that is. And there's a whole theory around how to do this. So for me, I've now reached the point where I use art and creative practice, I think in terms of creative practice rather than art itself, in order to allow us to work with this complexity, the complexity of the Anthropocene, and to hopefully use that as a way of thinking constructively around the sort of issues that we face. I think it's probably enough for now.
Thank you, George. That's great. Thanks. So I think we've got kind of a great overview of the different kinds of ways that you use creative methodologies and creative practices in your work. And I wondered if you could maybe say a little bit, I think you've started to say a little bit about this, George in particular, but also others, about what this enables you to do, these kinds of methodologies. So what do these methods allow you to do that other methods might miss? Or what are the kind of benefits of using these kinds of methodologies over other kinds of methodologies? I mean, you've talked about, Charlotte and George, about complexities of the context that we find ourselves in, and perhaps kind of addressing those complexities. Or as Siobhan has talked about, maybe providing an outlet in complex situations and in ways that other methodologies might not allow you to do that. So I'm just wondering if any of you, I mean, I'll open it up, maybe I'll start with Christine and then open it up to anyone who wants to make a contribution to that in terms of what these kinds of methodologies allow you to do.
Yeah, I mean, so thinking about what they've allowed me to do, I think because we've all done slightly different types of work, I think, and mine is probably so far less socially engaged than my colleagues who've spoken today. So, but I think the one thing that this kind of work has allowed me to do that's been quite powerful actually is it's kind of conceptual, I suppose, but is to reimagine what research is. I think that in the kind of, I often think about this in the terms of the framework of ref impact agendas, right? Because that's, we're all forced a lot of times to think about our research within these frameworks that are imposed on us externally, rather than letting our research be what it wants to be naturally, if you like. And the impact agenda of ref wants us to do underpinning research, which is published, written, peer-reviewed academic writing, and then have it make an impact in the real world. And that's the order in which things happen. And maybe you can have your published research come out after you've done your impact, but that's probably as upheaved as that model gets. And but I think doing this kind of work, and maybe it's just a bit too rebellious for the ref, but is in fact in thinking, why can't the artistic production, the creative production, be the research in itself? Why does the research have to be something that is written down, something that is analysed in an academic tone and published in a peer-reviewed journal? It can be that, but it can also be the act of creative production, the practice itself. And I mean, other, this is me coming at this as a classicist, other disciplines have known practice as research for years and years. Theatre studies in particular, practice as research is a very basic part of doing that academic work. But I think in some other disciplines, we often, and particularly in my discipline, where we're extremely old-fashioned, let's say it's classics, isn't it? We all know that it's an old-fashioned kind of backwards discipline in a lot of ways. We're trying to make it less so. But things like practice as research are so still unfamiliar, I think. And not only in my discipline, I think in other disciplines too, there's this sense that it's nice to do, but it's not real research. But of course it is real research. It's actually where the ideas are coming out, where the conclusions are arising, is in the practice. And so, yeah, well, to my theatre studies colleagues, that seems like a really basic point, but actually to me, it's been quite revelatory, I think.
Charlotte, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just I think there's practice-based PhDs, just to talk for a second, and then there's PhDs by publication, which is a slightly different thing. And I think I'm one of not many very established artists who have chosen to do a PhD by publication, is my understanding from my supervisor, in the way that it, I just want to pick up on what you just said, that the PhD values the creative process as practice and as an academic currency, actually. The practice as an academic currency, as well as the writing about the practice, and they sort of carry equal weight. And that's quite exciting, a development actually, because making work as a, I've been making work for a very long time, and actually to document the way that work is made and the socially engaged methodologies that's involved in that work is, I think, a bit unusual for someone. but correct me if anyone knows differently, but someone that's been working as an artist for 30 years to actually write about it. Because of course, like you with your ref, we're bound by certain funding criteria and targets and KPIs and all the rest of it. But actually, obviously, as an artist-led company, the focus should be the art. But the reflection on the art is quite unusual to do it in the depth that I've just done it, I believe, from what I've been told, as a publicly funded artist. And maybe, you know, we seem to be talking about that bridge between arts practice and academia, and I'm sort of looking at it almost from the opposite end from some of you. And you know, I've been in the real world, which is the arts world, for a very long time, and the work, it either falls or flies from an audience reaction or a press review or a, you know, testing against a completely non-academic field, which is really interesting when you then switch it and place that work and the thinking and the writing about that work into an academic context. And yeah, I think that makes it quite significant, because it highlights the sector development, it highlights the creative practice. In my case, it highlights the relationship of the arts practice to therapeutic values and methodologies. My PhD makes clear that the creative process is a safe haven and a secure base to steal from therapeutic language for the women that were involved, say, in art of attachment. It's embedding polyvagal theories of how to regulate. It's mirroring, you know, the creative process ended up mirroring attachment theory. And you know, you don't really realize that when you're making the work until you take a step back and reflect on the work that you've made. It's actually, my PhD is an account of intersubjectivity being in relation to other people. I didn't know that when I started writing it, but that's an outcome. It's an account of mentalization, which is understanding one's own emotions, because these are women that I work with that didn't really, beyond a therapeutic recovery program, didn't have a chance until they worked with me to kind of really dig into that. And it's a sense-making process for them, for example, and it resources participants. So those are very real, if you like, evaluative results from unpacking a creative process that you can then say, this has value, it has currency, it has some meaning in the therapy world, in the social work world, in the artistic world, in the academic world. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but it also unpacks what artistic form is, which we rarely do. We talk about dance theatre and people think about Strictly Come Dancing. It's not, obviously, it's completely different. So it's also it's a way to kind of say what the form is as well, the interdisciplinary methodology that creates a piece of work, and the writing process and the composing process and how you light something. These are things that are not usually written about in an academic context from the artist's point of view, I believe, anyway. And then, as I said before, the production by default of training resources or resources for you know, other practitioners to use, or one of the things that came out of Art of Attachment was a real desire to help and support less experienced artists to really understand what safeguarding in the arts is. And we've published, you know, some serious a resource on my website to enable younger artists or less experienced artists to really work safely, because I don't know if you know, but the Let's Create agenda of the Arts Council going forward is very much about, you know, working with marginalised groups, working with this, that and the other. And if you don't have the skills or the knowledge of how to do that, it's actually really unsafe. So I'm trying to put out there, from my experience, some resources for people to use. And we're actually holding a seminar at Goldsmiths on Monday with a small group to pilot the use of those safeguarding questions, which I'll put in the chat. So there are outcomes from this research that are really useful in the arts field, in the non-arts field, and in the academic field. And I think I might be on a one-woman mission to shout about that now that I've got a doctorate, because I think it's really important that the arts don't get categorised as just being, you know, airy-fairy arts, and that the academic field doesn't get categorised as just talking about itself because it's bound by these, you know, this ref thing that I'm aware of. We've had some EHRC funding, and I understand that there are the bindings in both areas. So I think it's kind of up to us to, you know, forge forward with these great kind of projects that show that the two things can sit together and be really, really useful, have some use, not just be up themselves, so to speak, but to kind of get out there and stimulate debate. I'll be quiet.
Thanks, Charlotte. Siobhan, did you maybe want to add something to that? I was thinking in terms of your writing practice and issues around safeguarding and working with groups that, you know, have experienced trauma and so on, and how these methodologies work well for that, but also what are the things that one needs to consider and be mindful of.
Yes, absolutely. I think to follow on from both the speakers already, the beauty of arts-based research is it provides ways of facing up to the complexities of doing itself, do you know? So the outcome of the safeguarding is, you know, an excellent outcome that other people can use. And that's typical of what can emerge from arts-based research projects. The outcomes may be unexpected outcomes, but invariably they're extremely useful and then can be adopted further on. So, I mean, what I've been thinking about in relation to what links the kind of projects that I've been doing with so many different partners and great experts in different fields. And I think RAIL came to mind, rail, to keep things on the rails. So relationality, and that was just mentioned there. ABR does upfront the presence and the stance of the researcher. You're not hiding behind a set of theories. You're actually going in, going, "This is me, and yes, I have prejudices, I have stances, I have a background that I'm bringing to this." But it also interrogates the scaffolding and the arrangements around the art intervention. And that means you're going to look closely at what the expectations are, what the possible coercive factors are, and in particular, as you say, with groups that might appear vulnerable, although all groups are vulnerable in their own way, you're going to look very closely at those. Moving on to A for agency, there's a sort of self and group reflexivity built into ABR methods about what is occurring and what can happen as a result of what's occurring, and that's the where individual voices can be heard, in individual expressions can feed in. There's a sort of a leveling factor in arts-based research, and I'm sure I'm not alone in the group here of people who do it, where if you're in the workshop room, you are going to join in. I won't have any you know, executives coming as observers. No, if you're in my workshop, you're writing. You too are facing the blank page. So there's a kind of inbuilt inclusivity there. And often the sort of questions we're asking, what is it are we doing? What can it become? How would we tell the story of what's occurring to others? All those things can lead to different senses of agency that mightn't have been there at the beginning, and that agency can then lead to those kind of other types of outcomes that you've been mentioning. So then moving on to I for identity, it does seem that the power hierarchies that might be present are forced into a picture, and we're forced to speak about them, and usually at the very beginning, because we're trying to obviously use co-research methods and to co-develop projects with those who know much more than us. And that type of process being important does seem to lead to certain kinds of self-making, where participants often speak about this very movingly afterwards, or as part of the feedback, where people discover elements of themselves that they then take on and go and do all sorts of things, create their own groups, make little films of what they've done next, and so on. And then L, I suppose in my case, has two elements. Language, obviously our work, the work I do is rooted in language, it's rooted in story. We also look at the strengths and weaknesses of inherited lexicons, and in different arenas, and you can imagine in the medical arena, people are working with quite dry medical empirical language, and facing up to that can often release them to work in much more symbolic and metaphoric ways. And then in legacy in terms of going forward, what's the legacy of these projects going to be? That's something I'd like to touch on later if we get a chance, because the doing is obviously the important thing, the speaking about it, the writing up, in terms of the project considering itself, but what can happen afterwards? Not all projects have a built-in legacy, and maybe they shouldn't, but maybe there are other ways we can feed into policy, and I think other speakers have begun to speak about that. In terms of working with vulnerable groups and the ethics, I know we're going to touch on ethics maybe more fully, so I might come back to that, but just to say that certainly from my own experience, I have been stung a couple of times to discover there are other agendas in the room or among the stakeholders, or among those who are, if you like, involved in governance. So what I've learned to do is in the pre-meetings, ask some very direct questions. What is in this for you? What do you want to happen as a result of this? In other words, how are you going to use this afterwards? And I try to flush out any hidden agendas. And if there are people not in those pre-meetings who really should be, I try to get them into the next pre-meeting, if you like. Because what I do find, and I'm very interested to hear if others find, I find that the work begins the minute you're in touch with a partnering organization, the work has begun, because the characterization of the work, the description of exactly what people are going to want to happen, begins then. So arts-based methods can actually have a lot to say about governance as well as just mentioned. But anyway, we'll circle around again to these, I'm sure.
Thanks, Siobhan. Thanks. I was wondering if you could ask, there's a question from someone online in the chat. So if you have access to it, to the chat, you can probably read it, but I will read it out as well for everyone. So the question is, so I have a question for the speakers. There are definite benefits for us to take our work out to the public, but I wondered if the speakers could reflect on the potential harms, emotional and psychological, when our work unbalances their sense of ontological stability. I guess in essence, how do we support people who struggle with the awareness they gain from engagement with our work? And I think that question, Siobhan, I think you began to address that a little bit, and that also is, goes to the question of ethics, and also goes to the question, I think, of how we work with people, how we partner with organizations, how we kind of involve participants, who those participants are, and so on, and whether there are particular risks, both to researchers, to the artists involved, to the participants, and whether there are actually enough supports in place, often within these research projects or outside of them, for people who actually perhaps are not, many of us as academics who kind of use these methods or have dabbled in these methods. I mean, I'm speaking about myself. I mean, Siobhan, and it's obviously not dabbling in what you're doing, but I would characterize what I've done as dabbling. Whether we actually have, the knowledge and the understanding of how to support people with this, or how to support ourselves in these kinds of situations. So I'll just open that up to the speakers, but also to anyone in the room who has worked maybe with these kinds of methods, if you'd like to respond to that particular question.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
If I can. I think there's a real risk of, and I'm thinking particularly about kinds of work less like Charlotte and Siobhan are doing, where you're both practitioners as well as researchers, but more about the kind of work certainly that I've done, I think, but also that I know other people are interested in doing, where somebody who is perhaps a more traditional academic or researcher is looking to partner with a creative practitioner of some kind, or somebody working in the arts. I think there's a real danger of essentially kind of a colonial model, essentially, where you are seeing yourself as the expert who is coming to bring your expertise to these people who are lacking something that you can provide them. I think there's a real importance in recognizing the expertise of your partners, that they hold knowledge that is different from the knowledge that you hold, and it may be a different kind of knowledge. The practical knowledge that, you know, Charlotte's talking about 30 years of experience in the arts, that's an invaluable level of expertise that is equal, if not superior, to the academic knowledge that you might bring to such a project. And so for me, there's a very, I've seen this certainly in the literature around consultation on modern productions of Greek tragedy, which is something I'm interested in at the moment. There's this habit that I think just gets perpetuated by happening over and over again, where a well-known scholar from Oxbridge, I'm going to be blunt about it, goes and advises on a production at the National Theatre, say, gives their expert opinion of what Oedipus Rex is about, and then goes away, and the artists can do whatever they want to with that knowledge. That is not co-production. That is not making work together. That is me coming as an academic and saying, I know something you don't know, and here it is, here's my authoritative knowledge, and okay, yeah, you can do what you want with it. You don't have to listen to it, but I'm not going to work with you to make something new. I'm just going to give you my old reading, and you can choose to listen to it or ignore it. And I think that, I mean, this is more talking about the dangers to the artists, and I think other people are better placed to comment on the dangers to the public or participants of other kinds. But I think there is very much a danger that academics who are not engaged in creative practice themselves look down on creative ways of knowing as somehow lesser than academic ways of knowing. They are certainly not. They are just as valuable, and if not more valuable, I think. And so I think that that's a real important thing to bear in mind when you're going into these projects, is that also that the artists you're working with have outcomes that they want for the project that are not necessarily your same outcomes. They have questions that they want to answer that are not the same questions that you want to answer, and there has to be space for those outcomes and those questions, as well as your questions and outcomes, and for the unexpected ones that arise as well.
George, I'm going to turn to you. I know you've been second, but because you haven't spoken in a while, I'll give the floor to you, and then I'll turn to Charlotte.
Okay, I mean, just to respond to what we just heard, I absolutely agree with what we just heard. I mean, for me, I think that, I mean, as somebody who's been an arts practitioner myself all my life, and a musician, for instance, I think that's what I do. I think it's really, really important that those who enter this sphere as academics have some experience of working creatively. Doesn't matter, in one sense, it doesn't matter how amateur one might feel, but just picking up a paintbrush or a saw or a hammer or blowing an instrument, whatever it is, you got to do it. You know, you have to be part to experience it and to feel what it feels like. For me, as an academic coming into this, my way of, and I entirely agree that arts practitioners have their own agendas, and that they, you know, you make a work of art, and that has to stand on its own feet, as it were, as a thing, as a set of experiences, etc. As well as any kind of social science style outcomes. For me, the way to approach it as an academic is to put my teacher hat on. That isn't my university lecturer hat. It's my being in a primary school hat. It's my adult education for the WEA hat, where one is an animateur, a facilitator, a kind of an entertainer, if you like, as a teacher, and that you kind of sit as a kind of itself. Teaching is a creative practice. And we have to remember that and reflect on our own practice and how we entertain, involve, encourage, enthuse those we're working with, not just telling them, but getting them to do something active and take an active part in exploring their own learning. And if we can do that as teachers, we can start to think our way into a better place to sit between the artists and the academics and the people we're working with. We also have to learn to let go. So you start a project off, you get people to think about something, then you have to let them do their thinking, and what they think is of value in and of itself, and not because it accords with what I think, but because they've thought it through and they have evidence and thinking which substantiates it. You've got to allow those forms of knowledge to stand and be valued as part of this process. So thinking of oneself almost like a primary school teacher, as somebody who's kind of lights the blue touch paper and stands back and lets it happen. It could be chaos, it might not be, but people are going to enjoy it, they're going to learn something out of it, seems to be really important. And it makes our academic teaching role and recognises the kind of creative side of that itself. So it isn't just the artists who are creators, the teachers are creators too.
Thanks, George. I will turn to Charlotte, and then I have Paul, and then maybe I'll open it up also to colleagues in the room. So I've got Sarah and Chanel after that. Charlotte?
Thank you. I don't call myself a teacher anymore, George, because it implies a power balance. And I like to think, playing on theatre company, who I created the safeguarding questions in the arts with, Jim Pope, the artistic director, we have very similar approaches, which is playing on define their work with challenging groups, different vulnerable groups. I agree with Siobhan's comment that all groups are vulnerable. The more I work, the more you realise that everyone is on a trauma spectrum. Everyone needs support. Everyone needs check-in, check-out, and some therapeutic kind of frameworks in any kind of group work. I would suggest, even if, and I do lecture and I do talk at people and I do do that, I'm the teacher and I have the knowledge, but that's not what I'm talking about in this practice-based area, just to say that. But playing on the point I'm trying to get to, playing on, talk about bringing together experts by experience and experts by profession. And I think that's a really useful phrase, because the women are experts in domestic violence, say, that I work with. They're experts in trauma, they're experts in their bodies being physiologically, psychologically and emotionally damaged, for want of a better word, through their experience. And I'm an expert in profession because of my practice and my ability to hold a space, to not freak out, to have lots of ideas up my sleeves like a primary school teacher. Okay, the balloons aren't working, let's get out the bean bags, let's try writing, let's try this, here's a piece of clay, here's this, and that reactiveness as a arts practitioner, I think, is the essential thing that you it's difficult to teach that, but you can provide a circumstance where that can happen. So when I was writing my PhD, and whenever I reflect on any kind of teaching that I now do, and I was in a special school on Monday, turned up without a plan because I need to see the group to then have the plan. And that's a real shift in the last 20 years of my practice, because I used to plan everything meticulously like a teacher, and now I don't bother because I know I've got what I need in me, so to speak. Is this notion of improvisation, because improvisation is scary, and improvisation, there is no route map because you don't know what's going to happen, right? But that's what I'm an expert in. And I don't mean leaping around, dancing. What I mean is I can improvise if things don't work. I can change direction at the drop of a hat. I can know that that person's having a panic attack over there whilst I'm still holding the frame for this person to continue their practice, whilst I'm still checking in with the therapist and the partner organisation. I can do all of that because that's the skill that I've built up over many years of practice. And one of the outcomes, which was really surprising in art of attachment for me, was, and I didn't anticipate this, which is sort of what Siobhan was kind of, you can't always anticipate, can you, what the really great outcomes are, is that for the 4 women that I worked with over a year to make this piece of work, and my God, they were, amazing women, who are very stigmatized and would be judged very harshly for the loss of their children, for their substance misuse, all of those things. They came back with some evaluation that was like, we've never had a secure female role model in our lives. And because I worked with them consistently and I turned up and I was a trustworthy figure, that was a completely not expected outcome, that I had become, if you like, an attachment figure or some kind of stable adult figure that they hadn't had with all of their childhood adverse experiences. So that's one tiny example of how the outcomes are not necessarily what you set out to do. Just to go back to the ethics of power, I've thought about this a lot because the women, say, volunteered on that project and I'm on a salary, so I'm paid. That's something that needs unpacking. When we work with young people, we actually employ them. And with a follow-up project next year, I think I will employ the women that work with me so that there's a bit more stability. But then even within that, if they can't cope with staying, which is always, you know, in a self-selective process, nobody's forcing them to be there. That's a high risk approach to making work because, for example, the day before the premiere of live premiere of Art of Attachment, one of the women nearly dropped out and was having panic attacks and all that kind of thing. 3 weeks before, there'd been some police involvement with one of the other women. And in terms of that, that tension between not only the practice and, you know, the experience and the profession, but also between the artistic organisation and the grassroots organisation are huge. I spent a lot of time unpacking that relationship between a grassroots the expectations, if you like, of a grassroots substance misuse organisation and me as an established arts organisation with certain assumptions of what would happen. And a lot of investment went into bulking up our support of the project from a company and a financial point of view to make it more stable. Because I think what comes out for me constantly in any practice is the process is not understood and people want the product in my world. And actually, I'm again on a one-woman mission to say the process is just as important, not in a I'm going to roll around the space and improvise way, but in a you want to turn up for the premiere, but there's a year of work that gets me to a point where I can have 4 vulnerable women and 2 professional collaborators on a stage performing something. And why would there be any understanding of what a creative process is from a substance misuse company? It's ridiculous to think that they might understand that, but a lot of the learning was how to bring them into what I was trying to do without it feeling too risky, too scary, too unsafe, too challenging, too confrontational. So I could go on and on about that, but I just wanted to say that I think that's what you were talking about, Siobhan, that kind of tension between the expectations where you might end up with a project are never really understood until you're in it. And then it's about communication and really meeting head on the power imbalance, the therapeutic value of what you're doing, the change in language that you have to use. I no longer, and I haven't for a very long time, use this expression giving voice to people. I'm not giving a voice to anyone. I'm providing a platform where they can find their own voices or not. And that's the risk I'm taking. It's not my job to give anybody a voice. But with my public profile, I can provide a circumstance where they might find a bit of their voice, which is marvellous.